Hi, we're back for Latin American Studies 3300, and this is the third class of the semester. What we're going to do today is I am going to attempt to get myself caught up with where I would like to be in terms of narrating the passage of time from the late pre-Hispanic period to the early colonial period. And what I really want to focus on today is to talk about the development of a colonial society, which was a process that is, of course, dependent on conquest, but in many ways is a process that was separate from that. And that's what I'll be focusing on today. And then in the second half of class, we'll be hearing from Professor Lois Zamora of the English department, who is going to talk about architecture, primarily art and architecture of the early colonial period, specifically the Baroque style. And what she's going to be addressing in many ways builds off of the history, the political and economic history that I will talk about today. And she'll be addressing how art is a way that culturally people can think about, talk about, express, or react to the political, economic, and social forces that are shaping their lives. And she will talk about one specific example of this by looking at the Baroque style and how it developed in Europe, and then what happens to it as it migrates to the New World, specifically to Latin America and especially to Mexico, where she has studied this in great detail. I'd also like to let you know that if you would like to look at the pictures that she talks about in her lecture today, you can find those on her website, and I'd like to give the web address. And I will put it up here and also read it out to you. Her web address is, of course, www, then period class, period UH, period EDU, /classes/Zamora. So let me very quickly write out her web address. Okay, and the Zamora, of course, should go right there. Okay. Before I get to the main topic at hand, since it's so related to what we were talking about last week, let me very briefly go over the outlines that connected to what I talked about last week. So we started last week by finishing up on the European and Iberian background to the foundation, the founding, exploration and conquest of Latin America. We talked about the conquest of the Aztecs, and that's pretty much what I finished up with, and I need today to pick up with the Spanish colonizing project. So we talked about the impact of the Reconquest. We talked about Ferdinand and Isabella's joint projects of rule and how they tried, especially through religion, to unite their separate kingdoms, not formally, but through religion and through culture. Then I talked about the conquest of the Aztecs. And one of the points that I wanted to stress here is that while there were many cultural differences between the Mexica and the Spanish, there were some similarities between them, and it was not necessarily absolutely foreseeable. It could not necessarily have been absolutely predicted that the Spanish would succeed, because there were many forces and many forces arrayed against them and many reasons to think that the conquest would have been, if not impossible, then very difficult. Yet for a variety of reasons that we talked about, the Spanish were able to be successful in their conquest. We then talked about the conquest in great detail And what I want to pick up with today is the whole subject of how to construct a colony. There's no one perfect recipe for that, of course. But it is also the case that Spain laid down a sort of blueprint that other colonial powers would either copy or decide not to copy. But other colonial powers of this early colonizing era all were forced one way or another to respond to the ways that the Spanish created a New World empire. But before I get to the nuts and bolts of that, which are pretty important, because the nuts and bolts of how the Spanish created a colony help explain many facets of the politics, economics, and societies of Latin America today. Before I get to the nuts and bolts of that, just as I finished last class by reading a very important and I think pretty dramatic passage written by native Mexica in the years just after the conquest, I want to start out by reading a few passages referring to important people. These are passages written by the Spanish, and these refer to important people and events in the period of conquest, in the period of exploration and conquest. Okay, the first one, quote, and I'll have to put on my reading glasses for this. As concerns his appearance, he was fairly tall, his face long and giving him an impression of authority. His nose aquiline, his eyes blue, his complexion light and tending to bright red. His beard and hair were fair in his youth, but very soon turned gray from his labors. He was witty and gay in speech, and eloquent and boastful in his negotiations. His manner was serious but not grave. He was affable with strangers and mild and pleasant with members of his household, and so he easily won the love of those who saw him. In short, he had the appearance of a man of great consequence. So who was this man of great consequence? That's a description of Christopher Columbus, written by the famous Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas, who lived in both the Caribbean and southern Mexico, and Las Casas himself was a prolific writer and major critic. Eventually he became a major critic of the Spanish New World imperial project. Okay, quote number 2. This voice declares that you are in mortal sin, and live and die therein by reason of the cruelty and tyranny that you practice on these innocent people. Tell me, by what right or justice do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery? By what right do you wage such detestable wars on these people who've lived mildly and peacefully in their own lands, where you have consumed infinite numbers of them with unheard of murders and desolations? Why do you so greatly oppress and fatigue them, not giving them enough to eat or caring for them when they fall ill from excessive labors, so that they die or rather are slain by you, so that you may extract and acquire gold every day? And what care do you take that they receive religious instruction and come to know their God and Creator, or that they be baptized, hear Mass, or observe holidays and Sundays? Are they not men? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? This quote, it's a pretty famous quote, comes from a sermon by a priest, also Dominican, named Antonio Montesinos. He gave the sermon in 1511 to the Spanish inhabitants of the island of Hispaniola. Third quote. Montezuma came in the middle of the street with two lords, one on the right side and the other on the left. All were dressed in the same manner, except that Montezuma was shod and the other lords were barefooted. Each supported him below his arms, and as we approached each other, I descended from my horse and was about to embrace him. But the two lords in attendance prevented me with their hands, that I might not touch him, and they and he also made the ceremony of kissing the ground. This quote comes from the letters of Hernán Cortés to the King of Spain, and of course he is describing his first encounter with the supreme leader, or Tlatoani, Moctezuma. I choose the quotes for a number of reasons. One is that I think they communicate very nicely and relatively briefly some of the drama that we've talked about in the different contexts in which the Spanish found themselves in the first decade after the turn of the century. That is, in the first decade of the 16th century. The quotes also suggest that the Spanish, like the native side, the Spanish were not monolithic. That is, they had a variety of opinions about the colonial project. And some of them, of course, many of them were completely in favor of them, but there were other Spaniards who not only disagreed, but disagreed vehemently and did so in writing, in speech, and their criticisms became the basis for a lot of criticism of Spain by other imperial powers. And these criticisms, such as those by Montesinos and then later by Las Casas, became the basis, in fact, for what's known as the Black Legend. That is, the idea that the Spanish were uniquely cruel in the ways that they created their New World colonies. The stories of exploration and conquest are enduringly dramatic. They're easily cast in epic and heroic terms. At the same time, the heroism slides easily into something else. It slides over easily into countless destructive actions, which cause loss of life, as well as massive amounts of property destruction, all of which left problems not only for the native societies, but created many problems for the Spaniards as well. In talking about the creation of a colonial empire, what I really want to focus in the first part of class today has to do with a key word that sounds boring, and I really hope will not be boring, but that is crucial. And that is, okay, once again, the key word is institutionalization. Creating institutions of colonial rule. It's a lot more mundane. There's some names and terms that I'll have to talk about. But without institutions of government, without the creation of a functioning economy, without the role played by the Catholic Church, New World colonies in central Mexico and in Peru and then in the other regions where the Spanish later went to, without the creation of institutions, the colonies couldn't have survived. We live in a time where government is criticized all the time as something that's powerful, almost evil, and lots of people like to think that we'd be better off without it. But whatever we think about it, I would maintain that it's for societies to have order. That is, for us to live any sort of orderly or stable daily life, whether we like a government or not, whether we like the form of a government or not, we have to have it. So that brings us to the following question. The Spanish in 1521 were literally standing, Cortés and his men were literally standing over the ruins of the Aztec capital, the city of Tenochtitlan, which they had in large part destroyed. They were standing on this ruined city. They were surrounded by corpses, and corpses who were dead, and in a sense, corpses who were living. That is, people who were so ill, so wounded, so dispirited, they could hardly go on. These people had seen the foundations of their society crumble, because as they watched the conquest take place, they saw an end to a political, economic, and cultural system that they had a total belief in. And that leads to the following question. What did the Spanish do? How did they govern? What they did was that they developed institutions, in part based on institutions that already existed in Spain, and in part based on the experience that they had already had in the Caribbean. They developed institutions that would blend with institutions of native peoples. So the Spanish are using institutions that already exist, but they are also using institutions of indigenous people that already exist. So the idea is that they don't simply destroy the culture and politics of the native groups like the Mexica and other groups allied with them, or like the Maya in southern Mexico. They don't simply destroy their culture and political systems, they change those things. And as Spanish ways of doing things and as native ways of doing things, in a certain sense, merge together over time, both are changed, especially native institutions. They certainly change over time. But native institutions play a role in the development of colonial institutions and colonial society. So Spanish imperial institutions didn't spring up full-blown. They weren't invented out of the genius mind of Spaniards in 1521 and following. The institutions grow up somewhat gradually, and they are rooted in the past, in the Spanish past and in the native past. And that's why we talked in detail about both of those societies prior to 1519. There are four aspects of what would be characteristic Spanish patterns that can be detected in this early phase, first in the Caribbean and then on the mainland. And one aspect of creating a colonial society in the early period I have split into two on the outline in the PowerPoint. Using labor and the economic system and the centrality of the economic system. Those two factors are crucially linked together. But in terms of creating an institutional structure, first, on the part of the Spanish, there was a tremendous emphasis on town and city building. In the Caribbean, an early royal governor ordered that Spaniards not live scattered about the island of Hispaniola, but instead live in more concentrated settlements. This, of course, reminds us of the urbanism of the Reconquest, and it's related to the idea of protecting the Spanish settlers. But it's also related to the idea of the city as a powerful place. The city is a place to protect oneself and a population, but the city is also a place from which to project power. And that's why when the Spaniards moved onto the mainland, that's why they built their capital city over Tenochtitlan, and why they tended to settle in cities that had already, in cities and places that had already existed within the urban environment as it was prior to the time that the Spanish arrived. In the Caribbean, specifically on the island of Hispaniola, by 1510, Santo Domingo, which is still the most important and largest city on the island, Santo Domingo was already the largest settlement and was well on its way to becoming a recognizable Spanish town with a central governing area and square, stone houses, and a layout that reflected the Spanish sense of social hierarchy. Houses, as well as public buildings, were already being built by drafts of native labor, which also were very important. No building of physical structures or institutional structures could take place without the labor of native peoples. That labor was crucial to the development of a colonial system. I would argue that as valuable as the silver was that the Spanish began to mine in very large amounts in Mexico and Peru, as valuable as the silver was, the labor that the Spanish used in the Caribbean and then on the mainland was far more valuable. It was fundamental, because without that labor, nothing would have been built, no silver would have been mined, no crops would have been harvested. So that the labor that the Spanish used, and I'll talk later more specifically about how they organized the use of that labor, how they actually got access to it. The labor that was used for building, for mining, and farming was fundamental. Native or indigenous laborers were not considered slaves. They were not the property of colonists. Spanish policy never promoted indigenous slavery, but when it began to be a problem, by 1542 it had been definitively outlawed. Yet native labor was forced, and the conditions under which natives labored, the conditions under which they worked, were very severe. As I said, I'll go into more detail about how the labor system worked. A third crucial aspect of colonial society and the institutions that allowed it to exist was the political system. The political system featured both high-level councils, two in particular, the House of Trade, created in 1502, and the Council of the Indies, created in 1524. These were councils in Spain that were created to advise the king and to supervise the political and economic functioning of the Caribbean and the mainland. But many officials were needed in the Spanish colonies as well. And a useful term that I can use to talk about the Spanish colony or colonies, because I will talk about the political jurisdictions and how these were defined a little bit later, a useful term that I can use that allows me to talk about all the Spanish governed areas in the Americas is the term Spanish America. And historians sometimes use that term to contrast with Portuguese America, which of course is the region that became Brazil. There were many different officials from viceroys on down who were responsible for the day-to-day decision-making in the various areas of Spanish America. And as I talk about the officials and the nature of the jurisdictions that the Spanish created, one thing you will see is that this was a highly centralized and very bureaucratic governing system. Lots of officials, and lots of officials cost lots of money, and that, of course, has some economic implications. But fourth, of course, there was a reliance on priests and the Catholic Church to minister to the needs of local populations. First, Columbus and the Spanish crown were thinking about the Spaniards who had emigrated. But on the mainland, in Mexico and Peru, the issue for priests and for the church was how to deal with native peoples. The native population was subject to what was perhaps the largest mission of conversion and evangelization and really cultural transformation that ever has been undertaken. The Crown was not prepared through its political system to undertake any sort of similar acculturating project. Just as the church had a role to play in Spain in terms of converting the Islamic and Jewish populations, which was the emphasis in Spain at the end and after the end of the Reconquest. We talked about that in the last class. The church had a similar task in Spanish America. Its role in conversion, its role in acculturation was critical. And however complex that task turned out to be, it's clear that the church had a lot of success. The religious landscape of Latin America is in the process of changing, but for hundreds of years, Catholicism was the dominant religion. Catholicism shaped many aspects of society and everyday life, and the Catholic Church was responsible for the success of its priests in carrying out this project of conversion and missionizing. What I want to go on and talk about in more detail now is to look at the economic and political systems in particular in more detail and talk about exactly what kinds of institutions the Spanish created. And the argument I'm going to make here is that while I would hate to be seen as a crude material determinist, in a way I am making a crudely materialistic argument in terms of the structure of Spanish America and in terms of the institutions and nature of the Spanish colonies. And that's because I think it is fair to argue, I think the historical evidence shows, though not every historian would agree with me, I think it's fair to argue that the creation of economic institutions was the driver behind the creation of colonial institutions more generally. The Spaniards were in the Americas for a number of reasons. while they were certainly there to convert souls, I would say more fundamentally, more basically, they were there to turn a profit. They were there to turn a profit in part because that was the theory of colonialism of the time. That is the mercantile theory, the mercantile idea that colonies exist for the benefit of the mother nation. And they were there to turn a profit because Spain, because of its own financial structure and problems, Spain needed a profitable colonial system in order to maintain many of its activities in Europe. I also think that we can show that the basic economic institutions predate the basic political and religious institutions. In other words, that there is a chronology, although I'm not terribly into chronology, and emphasizing that as the most important aspect of history, there is a chronology here which is important and which does give us some clues about what Spain was all about in this period. So what I want to go on and talk about now is to talk about a way of conceptualizing the colonial economy that I think is logical, makes sense, and I hope will help you understand its nature. What I'm talking about is conceptualizing the Spanish colonial economy as it developed in the years between 1521 and 1700. And what I really want to emphasize here is the idea that the colonial economy was divided into two sectors. And this is on the outline. There is a mercantile sector, or a mercantile economy, and then there is an internal sector or internal economy. And we also can think of the mercantile sector as the external economy. So there's a mercantile or external economy, and there's an internal economy. It is important for me to say that these are somewhat conceptual distinctions, and that there are some ways in which the sectors overlapped. But there were many ways in which they were separate. And the most important way in which they were separate and different is that they functioned for different purposes. The mercantile sector of the economy was that part of the colonial economy that was oriented toward Europe and based on capital. That is, it's oriented, I'll say that again, it is oriented towards Europe, and it's based on capital or money. It's a mercantile sector because it is based on the idea of moving goods, valuable goods, from Spanish America to Spain for profit. It is thus organized around export extraction. It's organized around the extraction of goods that were valuable. Precious metals, primarily silver, sugar, dyes, leather, chocolate, and wood. These were the main products that were flowing through and around the mercantile sector of the economy. Again, precious metals, sugar, dyes, leather, chocolate, and wood. European market conditions set the prices for these products. Spanish merchants and the Spanish government as a whole was dependent on these prices, which could fluctuate. In exchange for these goods, Spain's colonies received finished items, because as you will notice, these are commodities. While they might be worked on to some extent in the Americas, worked on and changed from their raw state, we can even say that about silver, they would not be finished until they reached Europe. Finished items like furniture, the technology used for mining, fine clothing, fine wines, a diverse list of other luxury items. These goods would be created in Europe and sold to merchants and consumers in Spanish America in exchange for the export items flowing from Spanish America. African slaves were also imported through this trade system, and we will come back to the whole issue of slavery and the Atlantic slave trading system. But when I talk about labor today, I will be talking about native labor. Is there a question?
Yeah. So what you're saying is sort of a cycle. What they would do is get the materials, create them in Europe, and then again sell them to...
Well, either sell those items, some of those items, or other items. It's really it's a little bit more complex cycle than the raw good goes from Spanish America, is finished in Europe, and then is sold back. It's a little bit more, that could happen in certain cases, but it is more complex than that because there's more trading, and there's more production in Europe that's involved in the development of the patterns of exchange as they grew over time. But basically, the idea is that you have primarily raw goods, but these are goods that are very valued by Europeans. You have primarily raw materials flowing from Spanish America to Europe, where they are finished and then dispersed in a variety of ways, some of which might have had to do with coming back to the Americas, but then other items that are already finished but are highly valued that the Spanish Americans the Spaniards in Spanish America want, these are sold back. There are a couple of aspects of the mercantile system, the mercantile sector of the colonial economy, that it is important to emphasize. One is that there is a kind of inherent instability in it. And that is because, as I've already mentioned, the prices for goods flowing from Spanish America varied. And we know this ourselves because all we have to do is read a newspaper or turn on the news each day and hear TV news people or read journalists talking about the price of oil. We know it goes up and down, and we're very interested in what's happening to the price. Well, producers of oil are just as interested, but whereas we're interested in a lower price, they're interested in a higher price. So there is a kind of cycle, and there's a kind of instability to prices, which is important because it means that colonial economies in particular, this type of mercantile economy, can be very unstable. You can develop a system of trade, as the Spanish tried to do, which is very centralized, systematized, bureaucratic. It's supposed to work in a very organized fashion, but that doesn't always happen. in part because prices and the prices of goods change. Other factors which influence the mercantile economy are natural forces, such as floods, droughts, or hurricanes, which can either damage trade items or interfere with the process of shipping. Then there's the whole issue, the whole large issue, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but there's the whole large issue of taxation, and connected to that, corruption. Because another factor which tended to sometimes weaken the proper functioning of the mercantile system was the Spanish government's desire to have high taxes and merchant desire to evade some of the taxes because the high taxes undercut their profits. And what that led to is merchants looking for forms of trade and people, places, or institutions to trade with that were not under the control of the Spanish government. And that undermines the mercantile system because it means that the government cannot completely control the flow of goods and the flow of profits, and therefore the flow of taxes. So mercantile systems have some inherent difficulties that make their functioning difficult, and therefore, while a mercantile system can sound very logical and like it's an almost perfect system of trade for the benefit of a colonial power, in practice, mercantile systems often have a lot of difficulty. Nonetheless, the mercantile sector was capable of producing enough profit so that it funded the colonial system, it enriched owners and investors, and it bankrolled Spanish monarchs. It bankrolled them in many of their projects, foreign policy and otherwise, in Europe. It created an enormous amount of wealth. If you go to London and you have the opportunity to see the crown jewels, I highly recommend seeing them, because you'll see the silver, the gold, and precious stones that came from a variety of areas of the world, Spanish America included, and you're seeing wealth transferred away from the regions from which it came and put to a kind of use that was common in this early modern period. It was a kind of use that was common, and it suggests the ways that wealth, the crown jewels suggest the ways that wealth was extracted from one part of the world by people who knew how to perform the labor in order to do that, and taken to and used for purposes and ends that have little to do with the people who did the work. And there's a sort of imbalance between the sectors of the economy that ultimately will have to be addressed by Spain. The other sector of the economy, of course, is the internal economy. The internal economy, the internal sector, existed to serve the basic needs of the population within colonial Spanish America. Again, the internal sector of the economy existed to serve the basic needs of the population within colonial Latin America. This sector of the economy produced the basic items needed to sustain everyday life. we think we need Starbucks or we'll die, but what do we need what do we need to sustain our daily lives? Well, we need food, we need clothing, we need shelter, we need the tools or the implements that we have to use to eat, to work, to do a whole variety of things that we like to do or that we think are important. So the internal economy was crucial. In 1521, even though many natives had been killed in the conquest period, there was still a large population, and from that year on, there was a large and growing Spanish population. And eventually what will happen is there will be a large and growing mixed race population as the different groups come together and socialize and have all the kinds of relationships that people have. People of mixed ethnic or racial heritage began to be born, grow up, and the middle mixed race sector of society by the end of the 18th century, the middle mixed race sector of society had become very large. It was actually the second largest portion of society after the native population, which throughout the colonial period was the largest sector within the population. But all these groups, all these people, they may have their own cultural styles, they may have their own definitions of what are necessary goods, but everybody needs food, clothing, and shelter at a minimum, and other kinds of items as well. And it's that need and the economy that grows up to produce those cheap goods that constitute the internal sector of the economy. Sometimes it is based on markets and money. That is, it is based on people going to markets to buy, using money, the items that they need or desire. Sometimes it's based on barter, trading items. Sometimes it's based on agreements to trade goods for labor. But the internal sector was just as important as the mercantile sector, because without the internal sector, the labor that the Spanish need to produce the goods that are traded in the mercantile sector, that labor can't continue to exist. So the mercantile and the internal sector of the economy are differentiated from each other. They relate to each other because the mercantile sector can't exist without the internal sector. But over time, one of the things that I think is most interesting about the colonial economy is that over time, these sectors of the economy begin to compete with each other. In the early colonial period, the mercantile sector was dominant. It was clearly dominant. But over time, as the population of Spanish America expanded, the internal sector becomes larger, stronger, and in certain ways more important. And when we get to the topic of independence, we'll see that if taxation without representation wasn't exactly the issue of Spanish Americans as it was for British North Americans. The relationship of the two economies was at issue, and there was competition, and ultimately there was conflict over the relationship between these two aspects of economy. But these aspects of economy also have some similarities, and that's because both are part of an economy, both are part of the provisioning and survival of people and society in a very basic material and physical way. And both depend upon a particular resource. That is, neither sector can function without that resource, and that resource is labor. So what I'd like to go on and talk about is native labor. What kinds of forms of labor were put in place through which the Spanish were able to profit from their Spanish American holdings, and through which the internal sector was provisioned with enough labor to create the goods that people needed in their everyday lives within Spanish America. Now, one of the first points I'd like to emphasize about the issue of labor and the use of labor is that in the areas that had been dominated by the Aztecs in Mexico or Mesoamerica and the Inca in Peru or the Andes, in those areas, the use of labor for public works, for creating items of trade or tribute, the use of labor for an imperial economy, for the needs of an imperial economy, that cultural pattern and practice, really set of practices, that cultural pattern and set of practices associated with it already existed. In other words, the Aztecs and the Inca were plenty capable of making people work and provide labor. So the problem for the Spanish, for the first conquistadors and then for the Spanish crown, the problem for the conquerors and the crown wasn't so much about creating a system of labor as it was about making use of a system of labor that already existed. When communities were conquered, when they were brought into the Inca Empire, when they were brought into the alliance, into the empire of the Triple Alliance, they were forced to provide labor. So the system of providing forced labor for the Spanish built on the system of forced or coerced labor as it already existed. This was particularly true on the mainland, in Mesoamerica and in the Andean region. In the Caribbean, in the very early first years of the 16th century, the situation was somewhat different and a little bit more complex. While there were native groups in the Caribbean, and in the first years of the 16th century, these groups and populations still existed, though in many parts of the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, these groups would become extinct. And they had become extinct largely by the mid-16th century. These groups were not organized into imperial systems, and the combination of spread of disease and the warfare that took place between Spaniards and these groups so decimated these populations that the Spanish were forced to enslave those members of local populations that they could, and they were also forced to begin to bring African slaves. So the Caribbean is one of the few areas where indigenous slavery did exist. But the crown, the Spanish crown, responded negatively towards slavery. They did not want to enslave the native population. And as I said earlier today, slavery was definitively outlawed for Amerindians by the Spanish crown or monarchy in 1542. So in the Caribbean, slavery, I'll get your question in a minute. In the Caribbean, slavery was a response to a particular set of conditions. There's a question.
Yes, I was wondering what the Crown said their reasoning was for outlawing slavery, because it seems kind of hypocritical. And did it have to do with the Catholic Church or pressure from them that it was immoral, or were they afraid of an uprising?
That's a good question that historians don't have a single answer to, but historians certainly have some thoughts about why the Crown was not only fine, but promoted the enslavement of Africans, but was opposed to the enslavement of Amerindians. Some of the reason does have to do with the position of, if not the Catholic Church as a whole, certain prominent clergy within it, especially in the Americas, where clergy like Montesinos and Las Casas argued against the enslavement of Indians. And why they were opposed to it is in itself, why priests would be opposed to indigenous slavery is in itself a complex question, having to do in part with the political conditions in the Caribbean that they were responding to. So the church certainly played a role in the development of the Crown's attitude about the enslavement of Native Americans. A likely second major factor was that the Crown was very opposed to the creation of any sort of power bases within the New World that could compete with the Crown for control of colonists and wealth. And they saw the possible formation of large plantations and slave owners who were very wealthy based on the enslavement as connected to the possible development of an alternative power base, and the Crown always took pains to work against such a development. It's also, I think, possible that the Crown and the Church and clergy shared the idea that it was their mission to not only colonize, but to convert and evangelize. And slavery was seen as being at odds with that goal. But it is an odd sort of contradiction that the opposition to enslavement did not extend to the enslavement of Africans, but was limited to opposition to enslavement of native peoples. On the mainland, in most parts of Mesoamerica, and then in Peru, slavery was not the primary means for organizing labor. And there were a number of reasons why that was the case. As I mentioned already, systems for extracting forced labor already existed. and the Spanish could make use of those, introducing a system of slavery which, although there was slavery in indigenous societies, it existed on a much, much more minor scale. So although a form of slavery existed in the late pre-Hispanic period, it wasn't developed enough to be useful for the kinds of labor that the Spanish needed. And the kind of system for the extraction of forced labor that existed among the Aztecs, that existed for the Inca, that existed also among the Maya, given that these kinds of systems already existed, it simply was easier for Spaniards to make use of the system for organizing and gaining access to labor that already existed. So what the Spanish did was to adapt and adjust some of their own practices that had developed first as part of the Reconquest and then in the Caribbean. What they did was to adjust and adapt some of their own practices to the situation that they found in the mainland. Very early on, the Spanish began to make use of an institution that they called encomienda. The institution of encomienda was the first means by which the Spanish crown and colonists organized the labor that they needed for agriculture, for mines, for public building projects, both in the Caribbean and then in the early colonial mainland. The concept of encomienda came out of the Reconquest experience. It referred originally to the assignment from the verb encomendar, to the assignment of Muslim villages to members of the military orders of medieval Spain. In Spain, the term also generally referred to the assignment of tribute payments to rulers and nobles. In the New World, it would come to have somewhat different meanings. In the Caribbean, encomienda began as a substitute for slavery. It began as a substitute for slavery, and it was seen in the Caribbean by rulers, the Spanish monarchs and governors on the islands of the Caribbean, as a sort of compromise between the extreme enslavement that some Spanish colonists were practicing and the free labor system desired by the crown. But in the Caribbean, the term encomienda began to serve as a sort of cover through which raids, capture, and what was virtually slave labor continued. On the mainland, the term encomienda came to have a narrower and more developed meaning. On the mainland, the term encomienda referred to grants of labor and tribute based on the established Indian community as it already existed, as the assigned unit. Again, on the mainland, the term encomienda referred to grants of labor and tribute based on the established Indian community as the assigned unit. So how this worked was that the labor of peoples of established Indian communities and their ruler were assigned to individual conquerors and settlers. In Mesoamerica, encomiendas tended to average about 6,000 Indians. They were not slaves, so they were not the property of the person who held the grant of encomienda, who's known as an encomendero. So encomienda is the institution. And an encomienda is held by an encomendero. It's a grant of tribute and labor. It's not slavery. It's also not a grant, it's not a land grant. It does not automatically give anyone ownership of land or even the right to use land. What it gives the holder, what it gives the encomendero, is the right to use the labor and gain the tribute of the people who are so assigned. Does that make sense? They're not slaves. To some of you it makes sense, to others no. I'll come back to the no in a minute. It's not slavery, at least not legally. It's not slavery, and it is not associated with land ownership. The encomendero does not own the land and doesn't have the right necessarily to use the land. He might gain it, but he would have to gain it separately and through other means. It's a right to tribute and labor. It's a right to work and the production, what is produced by the laborers. And as it originally developed, it's a right of tribute and labor with no limit. In other words, if I'm your encomendero, I could make you work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if that's what I chose to do. Now, of course, you'd likely either rebel or drop dead, but in such an abusive labor system, so it's impractical. But you see my point. There's no limits placed on it, so it's already inherently a forced system of labor because I simply have the right to your labor. But in addition to that, there are no limits placed on it, so I have as much of a right to your labor, as much of a right to the goods that you produce as I possibly can have. So it's coercive and it's highly abusive. Yeah.
So would it then be just a term? Because if you have the rights to their labor, do the natives have the right to refuse? So therefore it's not considered labor? It's not considered slavery?
It's not considered slavery because there's no ownership of people involved. But what I'm saying is that if you looked at the practice of slavery on the ground and you looked at the practice of encomienda on the ground, they don't look very different. That is a point that I do want to make. There's a legal difference between them, and it is important, but I do have the right to use physical punishment to force you to do the labor that I require. But there's somebody negotiating in between you as the labor providers and me as, in this case, the encomendera. And that is that the native leader, called by a variety of terms in different indigenous languages, but once the Spanish arrive, the native leader is often, I'm going to get how to use this pen more effectively. Okay. The native leader is often called, regardless of the area, actually the term comes from the Caribbean, but the native leader is often called, regardless of the area, often called by the term cacique. And there are caciques, or native leaders, who are the middlemen who intervene. And they are the people who actually have to carry out the forcing of labor. And they may try to do some negotiating between the two sides, between the person who holds the grant and the encomienda laborers. By the mid to late 16th century, a critique of the system of encomienda had developed. Some priests, many priests, saw it as abusive. Colonists who did not hold such grants were jealous and argued against the institution because they saw it as unfair. And the Crown was suspicious of it because, as I said about slavery and the problem of alternative sources of power and control, the Crown was suspicious that encomenderos wanted to become a kind of New World nobility or aristocracy, and the Spanish Crown was not about to permit such a development. So the Crown was suspicious of it, and there was resistance against it on the part of native laborers because of the abuses associated with it. Also, and very important in undermining the system of encomienda, was Indian mortality. As epidemic disease spread, Indians were dying in huge numbers. And the system could not work as it was intended. And I do want to go back and point out that while most encomiendas in Mesoamerica averaged about 6,000 Indians, Hernan Cortez had been assigned or had assigned himself an encomienda, and his numbered well over 100,000 Indians. So there was a variation in size, and no matter how large or small the grant of encomienda was, the institution of encomienda was undermined by all these factors. What was set in its place? By 1600, in Mesoamerica and in the Andes, a second system, repartimiento, or a rotational labor draft, came into existence. The term repartimiento was used primarily in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, an Andean term coming from the Quechua language, which was one of the main languages spoken in the Andes in that period and in the pre-Hispanic period. An indigenous term, mita, was the term used primarily to refer to the system of rotational labor that replaced the system of encomienda. The system of rotational labor draft functioned in the following way. Again, an area and a cacique would be assigned to someone through the system of repartimiento, to a Spaniard through the system of repartimiento. The communities in the area so assigned, and again, it's not a land grant, the communities in an area so assigned would rotate in providing labor, so that the men of the communities would have to provide labor for a certain number of days during a certain number of months each year. But the idea was that this was less coercive, less abusive, because the burden is shared through this idea of rotation. The other aspect of repartimiento that is important for me to point out is that it separates labor from the payment of tribute. Tribute is also to be paid, though by this time, by the late 16th and early 17th century, tribute has begun to turn into taxation. That is, instead of paying tribute in goods, you make payments, tax payments, through cash. And how do native laborers gain cash? Well, they're supposed to get a wage for their repartimiento labor. Government officials, private business owners who have laborers assigned through repartimiento are supposed to pay the laborers a wage, and part of that wage can then go to pay taxes. So this is, in certain ways, it's a very amoral or even immoral system, but there is a certain genius behind it, because the Spanish have the right to coerce labor, and then they use the labor to make goods, which the trade of which they often control and profit from. But through the wages paid for the making of the goods, they tax the wages, gain the capital that they need to maintain the colonial system. But repartimiento was undermined by some of the same kinds of opposition, as well also as by the spread of disease and the decline of Indian populations. What comes out of repartimiento is a system of wage labor. But it's not a system of free wage labor, because wage labor is connected to what is referred to as debt peonage. And after Professor Zamora's lecture, I will pick up next week with the concept of wage labor, how it operated in the early colonial period, and we'll then talk about the political system that was put in place to maintain and, in certain ways, control this economic system.